from the James Webb Space Telescope for a new dominant population of filamentary galaxies, some of which are shown here, in the early universe. I promise by the end of this talk, you will all know what I mean when I say galaxies are going bananas. Okay. Before I get started, I'd like to introduce myself. So as Matt said, I am a NASA Hubble Fellow at Columbia University in New York. What that means is that NASA has asked me to use their telescopes to do research that addresses fundamental questions about our cosmic origins. So questions like, how do we get here? Right? Things like, what is the universe made of? How did the universe begin? And then the topic of tonight's lecture, how did galaxies like our own Milky Way form? So before we get going on this, some of you might be wondering, well, what even is here, right? So of course, we're on the planet Earth, right? And we're orbiting around the sun. The sun is one of hundreds of billions of stars orbiting around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way itself is one of billions of galaxies that we've mapped out in the universe. And these galaxies and we live in a universe that is almost 14 billion years old. So kind of like people, our universe has a history, right? It's 14 billion year old history. And we're not going to talk about the detailed history of the universe tonight, except to say that astronomers like myself, we use telescopes like time machines to map out the history of this universe. And the idea is that, this is possible because light has a finite speed. So as you're looking at very distant objects like early galaxies, you're seeing them as they were when the universe was only a fraction of its age. So whereas today we see galaxies that look like, with a range of shapes and sizes at 14 billion years old or so, further back in time, we'll see galaxies, we'll see the light from galaxies reaching our telescopes now when the galaxies were only maybe a few billion years old, or even further out, a couple 100 million years old, and so on. So about 100 years ago, a famous astronomer named Edwin Hubble definitively established that there are other galaxies besides our own Milky Way. And then he characterized them. And one of the things that he noticed is that there's actually many round galaxies that appear round in projection on the night sky. And this is one of the things that he used to justify his development of something known as the Hubble tuning fork diagram shown here, or the Hubble sequence. And the fact there are many, many round galaxies on the sky is what led him to introduce this one class of elliptical galaxies that are in 3D relatively, spheroidal. So they appear round in projection very frequently. And then on the other hand, we have these two classes of related spiral or disky galaxies that are organized based on the prominence of their spiral arms, as well as the presence or absence of this elongated bar-like structure at the center. And so a lot of my work tries to ask, well, why, despite the great complexity of galaxies, can we organize them into very simple classification diagrams like this Hubble tuning fork? So about 35 years ago, a very famous telescope named after Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope, made many great discoveries. Right? It was launched then. And one of the cool things that it did is it surveyed tiny patches of the sky, much smaller than the full moon. And one of these things was called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Right? And so we can enlarge this. And what originally would look like just a blank, small, dark patch of the sky actually reveals thousands and thousands of galaxies, each which have hundreds of billions of suns. Right? And you can see they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And back in the 90s, astronomers asked, well, what do some of the early galaxies, the ancestors of our own Milky Way, look like? And they discovered these things that they called chain galaxies. And these chain galaxies typically are not only blue, but they also are very linear. They're linear-looking objects. They're typically very clumpy. You can see some other examples here. And so this clumpiness is what led these astronomers in the 90s to call these things chain galaxies. In the mid-2000s, with the installation of new instruments on the Hubble Space Telescope by NASA astronauts, there's nice work that did a census of the different kinds of shapes of galaxies in the early universe, and these chain galaxies really just dominated the faint early Milky Way progenitor population. There were also other classes of galaxies that were related, like tadpole galaxies, which were also very common in the early universe. They're like these asymmetric, lopsided galactic distributions of stars. And then the spirals and ellipticals that we're more familiar with, they were relatively rare in the early universe. They hadn't had time to really form their intricate, complex structures yet. So one of the interesting things about using telescopes as time machines is if we're looking at light from the early universe, we know that the universe is expanding. And so as that light is traveling to us in an expanding universe, it gets stretched out. And when it gets stretched out, it becomes redder. It has a redder color, right? And so it's actually very hard for the Hubble Space Telescope to observe very early galaxies like the progenitors of the Milky Way, because their light is going to be very red, actually into the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so this is the motivation for why NASA and the European Space Agency built the James Webb Space Telescope. It's an infrared telescope. It's much larger than the Hubble Space Telescope. And so it can actually see galaxies much further away, aka much earlier in the universe. So JWST is really an amazing piece of engineering. It had 344 single points of failure during launch and deployment. And the launch and deployment went so well that what was originally supposed to last only about 5 years, we're already in year 4, it's actually going to last, we think, 15 to 20 years at least. And so there's lots and lots of more exciting science to come. And so JWST actually does not orbit around the Earth like the Hubble Space Telescope. Instead, it orbits around the Sun in an Earth-like orbit at this thing called the L2 Lagrange point. So JWST is actually 1 million miles away from the Earth. So why is it so far away from the Earth? Well, it's because, as I mentioned, JWST is an infrared telescope. So its infrared cameras, with which we use to take these pictures of early galaxies, need to be kept extremely cool. Because if they're hit by sunlight, that sunlight is going to heat up the cameras, and that the cameras will emit the infrared radiation of their own due to the heating from the sun, and that'll wash out any faint light from these early Milky Way ancestors. So, you know, where this gold-plated mirror is, right, and the instruments of the cameras, right, that's on one side here, and then below it is, on the other side, is this sun shield, where it's about 85 degrees Celsius, so actually very hot, a few hundred degrees hotter than this other side where the telescope actually is, which is about minus 230 degrees Celsius. So I'm very lucky to be a member of what's known as an early release science team with JWST, right, known as SEERS, the Cosmic Evolution Early Release Science Survey. I was very lucky. I got involved with this actually when I was just starting out as a PhD student at Santa Cruz, California. And so here's a picture of us back in May 2017, 7 years ago, scary to think about. We're in Austin, Texas, and so I was visiting along with several other key members here, and I was shadowing the PI, the leader of this team, Steve Finkelstein, a professor at UT Austin at the time. And so we got our data finally about 2 years ago, and so at the top here is some of the deepest imaging that we had prior to JWST. So like 50 hours of staring at the same patch of sky, some of these early elongated chain galaxies with the Hubble Space Telescope. And then JWST comes along in 2022, and in less than 1 hour, for the same galaxies, it just maps them out in such great detail, way better than what Hubble could do in 50 hours. Right? And so what we wanted to do is use this amazing data to revisit the question of the chain galaxies and their origins and connections to the Milky Way. Okay, so this Sears field is this tiny little rectangular patch up here. It's another one of these things that we call the pencil beam survey, right? Because it's just, we're surveying such a small part of this much larger sky. So you can see it's a little rectangular field next to this much larger Big Dipper on the sky, which many of you have probably seen. Right, so this is old Hubble imaging. We can zoom into that little rectangle, and you see a beautiful population of thousands of galaxies. And so what we did is we essentially characterized the projected shapes of every galaxy. Right, so we measured for every galaxy this fundamental parameter that we call the projected axis ratio, which is you fit every galaxy with some ellipse. Right? And then you characterize it by the ratio of the semi-minor to the semi-major axis length B over A. Right? And when this B over A ratio is close to 0, it means the galaxy is basically almost linear, very elongated on the sky. When the ratio is close to 1, it means that the galaxy is very circular, round on the sky. So we did this for all the galaxies that we had in our JWST imaging in this little rectangular field. And then we did a very simple counting experiment that actually all of you can do. Right? For galaxies that are of a similar brightness and a similar distance as between each other away from us, what is the distribution of this B over A parameter? Right? For galaxies that have a similar brightness and a similar distance away from us, what is the distribution of B over A? And when we do this for different samples of galaxies, including galaxies in the early universe that we think have brightnesses and distances away from us that make them roughly the ancestors of Milky Way-like galaxies, we see this kind of distribution, right? So this is the number of galaxies as a function of this B over A. So if you're small, you're edge on. If you're linear, if you're large, B over A, you're circular. And you can see the distribution is not roughly flat or uniform. In fact, there's many more low B over A elongated galaxies with B over A about 0.3 to 0.4 than there are round galaxies in the early universe, right? And so this is kind of the chain galaxy puzzle revisited now with the much more sensitive James Webb Space Telescope. All right, galaxies going bananas. Why do I say that? Well, with my amazing collaborators, this title is inspired by this diagram. So in the previous diagram, I was just showing you the distribution of B over A alone. But what we actually look at in our modeling is the joint two-dimensional distribution of these axis ratios and how they vary as a function of the sizes of the galaxies, right? And so in this diagram, as you can move to the right, you're looking at larger size galaxies. And you can see, again, for this early Milky Way progenitor example representative population, it's tracing out a particular shape in this diagram. There's a lot of galaxies, especially at larger sizes, that are popping up at small, elongated B over A. And there's a deficit of things up here to the top right. And so this distribution, when we made this figure, it looked to us like it was the shape of a banana. And so that's the inspiration for the title of the paper, of the publication, Galaxies Going Bananas. Right? You can look at some of the images of these galaxies from James Webb, and again, they're consistently very flat, right? Very elongated and linear looking. Many of them are clumpy, like the old Hubble Space Telescope chain galaxies from the 90s. And the main point of my talk tonight is just, we see way too many galaxies in the early universe that look like this, which implies that if you want to preserve isotropy, that everywhere you look in any direction, you should see galaxies randomly oriented, right? If you want to preserve that large-scale isotropy, it means that not all of these things can just be galaxies like our own Milky Way, spirals seen from the side. So as Matt mentioned, I was not prepared for the amount of press that this would get. It ended up on the front page of the New York Times back in January with this nice article by Dennis Overby entitled "The Early Universe May Have Gone Bananas." I had a little bit of fun with it myself. Columbia did a press release. You can go on YouTube and check out a video where I kind of leaned into the banana analogy. And then NASA and ESA actually also did a press release with the beach-themed analogy. So galaxies are frisbees and surfboards and pool noodles and volleyballs and so on. So very exciting stuff. And what I want to do now is I want to map out the landscape of possible explanations for this puzzle. So the safest thing that I and many other astronomers would say to explain this puzzle is that there's some kind of bias in our observations, right? So it's actually much easier to detect these kinds of linear structures if they are normal spiral galaxies seen from the side, because all the light is concentrated in a plane, right? So it's going to be easier to detect and pick up. And it's much harder to detect actually these face-on spirals, disks, because especially their outer parts can be very faint. So this is one possible explanation, but there's another camp of astronomers, including myself, which argues that, well, this is definitely worth considering, but actually we might be seeing evidence of intrinsic 3D geometrical evolution in the galaxy population, such that as you're going towards the early universe, the ancestors of Milky Way-like galaxies are not these kinds of circular, frisbees and disks and so on. Instead, they're significantly flattened along a second axis. So they're shaped like what are known as prolate ellipsoids, or like these triaxial ellipsoids. And these shapes might seem very exotic, because we don't see these kinds of things in large numbers in the local universe, but we do see structures that resemble this a little bit in massive galaxies nearby. They're called bars. So here's a famous example of what's called a barred disk galaxy, the bottom part of the Hubble tuning fork, right? It's a spiral galaxy, right? You can see these spirals, but there's actually this elongated bar-like structure at the center. So sometimes, one argument or one explanation is that what we're seeing with all these elongated galaxies are just like these bars without the extended spirals, which would be too faint for even JWST to observe, right? This probably is not exactly analogous to our galaxies, because these kinds of bars locally are seen actually in very bright, massive galaxies. Our galaxies, the chains, they're actually very low mass, they're faint. And you typically need a very massive disk to be able to funnel stars into this central elongated bar-like structure. And we are not in that regime for our early chain galaxies. And then the last thing is, well, the early universe is very messy. So there's lots of galaxy mergers, right? And so how do we know when we look at something, like these two objects, that is this actually a chain galaxy, or are one or both of these things just multiple smaller galaxies that are just in the process of merging together to then eventually build, the Milky Way, for example. So we have thoughts and ongoing projects to try to address all of these interesting and exciting explanations. One thing I'll just say is, we think we've ruled out this explanation on the top left. With James Webb, it's such a big telescope, it's so sensitive that, if there were large face-on spiral galaxies, we should have seen them. We understand the limits of our data. And so we think we rule this out. And I want to kind of dig in a little bit to this 3D geometrical evolution explanation. So if you're like me, it can be hard to visualize these kinds of what are called ellipsoids in 3D, right, in your brain. And so here is some examples. So here are some extreme examples of simplified ellipsoids. So you have something called spheroids, which are basically like perfectly round, spherical objects. You've got these circular or axisymmetric disks, right, in the middle here. And then you have these prolate ellipsoids on the right. So here is the definitive analogy, straight from New York City, for how to visualize these things. Start with a perfectly round ball of dough, right? In 3D, that is a spheroid. Flatten that ball of dough along one axis, and you get the greatest thing in the entire universe, a pizza. Exactly, right? Now, take that pizza and flatten it along one of the other two remaining axes, and you get my other favorite thing in the entire universe, A baguette, yes, exactly. You call it baguette in Europe, I call it a breadstick in New York. So exactly, this is what you should have in mind for these simplified kinds of ellipsoids. Now, the key thing to know is that if you have a population of each of these kinds of ellipsoids, right, they're going to leave a unique signature on that B over A versus size diagram. So for example, take spheroids. As Hubble himself mentioned 100 years ago, a population of spheroids, no matter what you look at them, they're going to appear round in projection on the sky. So they're going to appear near the top of the diagram, right? The same B over A size diagram. These circular disks are different. You should see a population of disks from all viewing angles, right? You're equally likely to observe a disk from all viewing angles, and so you actually get a vertical uniform stripe in this diagram. You should see equal numbers of the disks seen face on when they're going to appear like circles, and equal numbers seen edge on with small b over a, seen from the side. And this distribution trails off at some lower limit for the axis ratio because disks have a finite thickness. They're not like infinitely thin, right? Now the third class of ellipsoids, the prolate ones, are fundamentally different because they have two short axes. So they're kind of like this clicker, right? So this clicker is approximately prolate. You're much more likely to observe this clicker like this or like this, and very rarely, if the viewing angle is just right, you'll see it directly down the barrel when it looks like a small circle on the sky. And so a population of prolate ellipsoids are going to actually trace out our favorite fruit on this diagram, a banana, right? And so that's the solution to the puzzle. We think that there's this new population of intrinsically elongated, nearly prolate ellipsoid galaxies in the early universe, many of which we think are the ancestors of galaxies like our own Milky Way. So from this, we do lots of statistics, which I'm going to skip over. And we get to the key question, the key result, why this is so important and fundamental, right? So here is the fraction of galaxies as a function of the look-back time for two types of, basically two mass bins, right? So galaxies as a function of look-back time that have total mass in stars of about 1 billion suns, and then galaxies that are about a factor of 10 times even more massive, right? Our Milky Way today has a mass in stars of about 5 times 10 billion suns, right? And so these distributions, these colors, is the fraction, the fractional contribution of these prolate ellipsoids, these circular disks in cyan, and then these spheroids in pink. And what you notice is that as you go towards the early universe, as you go towards 13 billion years ago, you're seeing the contribution of the prolate ellipsoids just dramatically increase, right? So nearly 50 to 80% of these early galaxies are approximately prolate. And on the other hand, as you go towards, closer to us when we can measure it with James Webb, the contribution of the circular disks is increasing, which is a nice sanity check because in the local universe, including for our Milky Way, we think we see a lot of galaxies fall into this, they're basically oblate, spirals, they're pizzas. Now, this rise in this prolate fraction to 50 to 80% as you go to the early universe is very striking, right? And you should immediately ask, well, how does this fit into our picture of galaxy formation? And so we have very powerful computer simulations. And these computer simulations, they model the origin of that Hubble sequence, the origin of galaxies like the Milky Way, right? And in these simulations, we not only predict the shapes of what the stars are at early times, but also something called the dark matter, which we can't see with our telescopes directly, right? But in these simulations, we can predict the distribution of this dark matter and how it connects to the distribution of the stars. And in these computer simulations, we predict that actually galaxies live in these halos of dark matter that are themselves also elongated, nearly prolate at early times. And this entire system, dark matter plus stars, it lives in this large-scale filament of the cosmic web, right? And so what's the cosmic web? Well, here's a much larger simulation now. This is just evolving dark matter under the influence of gravity on very large scales. And you can see that over billions of years, the dark matter is collapsing along what are known as sheets and eventually these filaments, these tendril-like filaments. And it's along those filaments that these first elongated galaxies we think are forming and why we see so many of them. Right? So back when I was in grad school with my advisors at the time, Joel Premack, Sandy Faber, David Koo, Avishai Deckel, some of the pioneers of galaxy formation modeling and observations in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the reason I got into this field is that we proposed that if these galaxies are actually forming along filaments of the cosmic web, they should actually point towards their neighbors and towards each other on very large scales, tracing out filaments, almost like if you have light bulbs strewn along strings, right? And so here's a projected view of the dark matter distribution from one of these computer simulations, and these little cyan things are actually individual galaxies in these simulations. And you can see that it's hard to see by eye, but they're basically tracing out the dark matter distribution. And so back in 2019, I wrote a paper with my advisors basically predicting the signal that we should see. And this orange curve here just shows this excess of aligned galaxies that we expected from our models, from these kinds of models that I showed you before and these kinds, right? So a very clear excess of aligned pairs of galaxies, but then in the Hubble Space Telescope observations at the time, we did not see that kind of excess, right? And there's many reasons for that, but recently we revisited this question of alignments now in the context of also gravitational lensing, which is the process by which a massive foreground density of material is going to actually bend space-time, and it's going to cause background early galaxies shapes to be distorted. They become more elongated intrinsically. So this is with my collaborators Avi Loeb, Guillermo Barro, Liz McGrath, and Steve Finkelstein. And so what we did is we essentially went into our JWST observations, right? And we essentially identified patches of the sky in our observations where actually the galaxies are aligned. So we think we're seeing the alignments that I tried to look for a couple years ago. So here are some example little patches of that same Sears survey. It's hard to tell by eye that there's actually a non-random alignment patterns here. If you stare at this long enough, as I have, you'll start to see some very interesting patterns, like almost like these circular arrangements of galaxies. If anyone here is familiar with electromagnetism, some of these things are arranged like polarization type patterns. And in other cases, like these long, almost like chains of objects, right? And so these distributions on the bottom here in orange, these are called null hypothesis distributions, where I have millions of realizations of every individual field where I've kind of assigned every galaxy, which is here shown with these little rectangles. I've assigned every galaxy a random orientation, and then I kind of compute a summary statistic, and the orange distribution is what we should get if the galaxies are kind of just randomly oriented. And then the cyan line here is the actual measurement of this alignment statistic for each of these fields. And you can see that we're way out in the tail of the distribution in orange. And so this is very unlikely to be random orientations. So there's many reasons for the alignments. We're still doing a lot of follow-up work to disentangle whether the alignments are due to gravitational lensing by foreground matter, or whether in some cases actually the alignments are in fact due to these galaxies being aligned along the same filaments and large-scale structures in the early universe. Okay. All right, the last thing I want to end with is the smoking gun test, the borderline impossible thing that I am trying to do next. So if you look at any one of these elongated Milky Way ancestor galaxies, like this one here, for example, seen with James Webb, no one can tell you, I cannot tell you, this thing is definitely a circular disk seen from the side, or this thing is definitely an oval triaxial ellipsoid or a prolate ellipsoid seen from the side. No one can say that just from the imaging alone. It pops out when you do the statistical analysis like the ones that what I showed you earlier. The way to tell this is you have to go in and you have to actually understand how the stars are orbiting around the center of this object, right? So in the Milky Way, as I mentioned, the sun is going around the center of the Milky Way in roughly a circular orbit, right? We're going on the center of the Milky Way in a roughly circular orbit. Those kinds of orbits are impossible or very subdominant for stars in triaxial or polar ellipsoids. Instead, the dominant kinds of orbits that you get are things like pretzel and fish orbits. This is a top-down view of a star that's simulated undergoing one of these kinds of orbits. It kind of just goes back and forth, right? Another kind of orbit is a boxy orbit, where essentially the stars are going just back and forth along the center of the system, whereas a circular orbit would avoid the center of the galaxy. These boxy orbits go arbitrarily through the center of the system. And then the last kind of dominant orbit, I swear I'm not making this up, banana orbits. Right? So stars kind of just go back and forth like this. If you put two of these banana orbits back to back like this, you get an X shape that is actually seen in some local barred spiral galaxies. So this is borderline impossible to do with even James Webb. But luckily, actually here in Europe, astronomers have invested billions of dollars into these next generation telescopes on the ground, the extremely large telescopes. So the European one, illustrated here, and then there's two in the US, the giant Magellan telescope in Chile, and then the 30-meter telescope, which was going to be in Hawaii, but is TBD. So stay tuned for work that we're doing with JWST now to see, take the first census and see, can we even get a hint of kind of constraining some of these kinds of orbits and really kind of setting the stage for this next generation of ELTs that they're going to go online in the next 10 years or so. All right, so I'm going to stop there and summarize. Hopefully I've convinced you that galaxies are in fact going bananas, and there's a specific meaning for that. And in detail, galaxies appear to start out elongated, and this may be connected naturally to their formation along filaments of the cosmic web. And we have some evidence from JWST now for alignments between these high redshifts or these very distant early galaxies on very large scales. So I'll stop there, take any questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. What a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating research.
Yeah.
Love the tantalizing hints of what we're going to get with this next generation of telescopes.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions for our speaker? I'm going to put the lights up a little bit so we can see you properly.
Bit of a light-hearted question. Is the extremely large telescope bigger than the very large telescope?
Yes. Yeah.
How much?
So the ELT is about 39 meters, a bunch of segmented mirrors put together. And the VLT is about 8 or 9 meters, I think. Yeah. So 3 times larger. Yes. Or. Okay, great. Question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for one talk. I was just wondering, is it possible to, because you're saying that across time you're tracking all galaxies by their emission from infrared spectrum, is it possible to track the fate of the galaxy by shortening your wavelength over time?
Interesting.
Therefore deciding if it is indeed evolving into a spherical shape because you're just by amending wavelength.
Yeah. So the question is, we're observing these early galaxies at infrared wavelengths, and if we were to observe them at shorter wavelengths, like in the ultraviolet, can we track those galaxies evolving as a function of time?
Yes.
Great question. Yeah. So the evolutionary timescales for individual galaxies are on the order of billions of years. So you can't actually observe any individual galaxy evolving. So the way that astronomers address this question is kind of like archaeology. You actually, when you point a telescope at the sky, you observe statistically large samples of independent different galaxies at different snapshots of the universe. And you try to connect them statistically. So for any individual galaxy, looking at it at different wavelengths, different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, will not let you infer how it by itself will evolve. But there's an interesting point to your question, which is galaxies are comprised of stars, and stars actually start out relatively blue. They emit a lot of when stars are young, they emit a lot of their radiation, their light, at ultraviolet wavelengths. And when they get older, as they get older, they become redder. And so when we're observing with a telescope like James Webb in the infrared, we're seeing like the bulk of the older, long-lived stars. And if we look at these galaxies at bluer, like ultraviolet wavelengths, then we'll see mostly the very young, recently formed stars. And when we, if we were to look at the same galaxies that I looked at ultraviolet wavelengths, in these cases, in the early universe, everything is young. So they all look similar, whether it's ultraviolet or infrared. Yeah.
There's a question down here at the front.
Yes.
So what was the time difference between the two telescopes when they were launched?
That's a great question. Yeah. So the Hubble Space Telescope was launched in 1990, and then the James Webb Space Telescope was launched in 2021. Right. So 31 years, if I do the math right.
Putting you on the spot for
Yes.
stars maths.
Yeah. And actually, the James Webb Space Telescope had been in the planning stages when Hubble was first launched. Even before Hubble was launched, they used to call it the Next Generation Space Telescope, and it just continuously kept getting delayed because building these telescopes and launching them requires billions of dollars, and so you have to convince the governments of the world to contribute money towards that.
And a question in the middle.
Will we be using any more telescopes to see further back?
Yeah, great question. So will we be using any more telescopes to see even further back in time? So I didn't talk about this here, but so James Webb is an infrared telescope, but there are actually redder wavelengths beyond the infrared. Yeah, exactly. You're ready to be an astronomer. So yeah, microwave telescopes, exactly. And these are typically on the ground in places like Antarctica and Chile and so on. And so these actually are able to observe not necessarily the galaxies like the ones that I showed you, but they observe actually the afterglow of the Big Bang itself. So they go actually all the way back, the furthest that we can see. It's called the cosmic microwave background. Yeah, and then there will be other telescopes that NASA and ESA are jointly planning that will go. James Webb doesn't go into the far infrared, which is like this kind of midway point between the near infrared and then the microwave regime. And so there's going to be a next generation of great observatories, the ones that will replace, Hubble and so on. And one of those is going to be a far infrared mission.
So we can actually, the observable universe is 46.5 roundabout billion miles, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the
Light years. Yeah.
Sorry?
46.5 billion light years.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So that's with the JWST, or with the how far back could you go with the microwave?
So the microwave, you go. I think it encapsulates basically the extent of that. So 46.5 gigalight years or so. Yeah, that's the extent. James Webb actually it goes a few hundred. Well, I usually think of this in terms of the age of the universe. And so James Webb basically it sees galaxies as they were when the universe was about 200-ish million years old after the Big Bang. And so that'll be actually pretty close to the 46.5 gigalight years.
Okay, we have a question on the right-hand side.
Can the banana galaxy go back to its original form?
That's a great question. So can a banana galaxy go back to its original form? So what we think right now, the current working theory, which you may be the one to prove or disprove, is that galaxies actually start out like bananas because they're forming along these like filaments of the cosmic web. And then over time, via processes that we don't completely understand, they're able to transform their shapes from banana to these balls of dough and pizzas. And we think you probably can't go back from a pizza shape or a ball shape to a banana, but you can go the other way around. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think, well, maybe with this talk of pizzas and bananas, we progress to the refreshments. So first of all, Dr. Viraj Pandya, can we thank our wonderful speaker again? So we'll have a break for some tea and biscuits, and then we'll be back here for a second talk afterwards. I think I'm going to have me as a speaker, so I might tell you a bit about dark